Nurse Priya Anand had been standing motionless in that trauma bay for exactly 4 seconds when Dr. Foster Langley decided she'd frozen under pressure, a judgment that would nearly cost her career before anyone bothered asking what she'd actually been doing during those 4 seconds. She hadn't frozen. She'd been listening, with the specific, trained attention of someone who understood that 4 seconds spent gathering critical information could mean the difference between a coordinated response and a chaotic one. Langley, watching from across the room with growing fury, saw only stillness, and stillness to him meant failure. Priya started at Westgate Medical Center 9 months earlier, 29 years old, composed in a manner that some coworkers read as calm competence and others, particularly Langley, read as an unsettling lack of urgency. Dr. Foster Langley, Westgate's chief of staff, ran the hospital with a management philosophy built around speed and decisive action, values he applied uniformly across every department regardless of context, and Priya's more measured approach to crisis situations had rubbed against that philosophy from her earliest weeks. "She hesitates," Langley told the nursing director during her second month, not lowering his voice enough. "In this business, hesitation costs lives. I need staff who move instantly, not people who stand there processing when seconds matter." Nursing director Renata Foss had raised an eyebrow at that, but said nothing. Not yet. Langley's assessment hardened quickly into a specific, ongoing scrutiny of Priya's every action during high-pressure situations. He watched her more closely than he watched most staff, searching, whether consciously or not, for confirmation of the judgment he'd already formed. "Anand, when a code comes through those doors, I need you moving immediately," he said during a departmental meeting in her 4th month, using her as an implicit example in front of the assembled staff, not standing there assessing the situation like you've got all the time in the world. Priya, absorbing the public criticism with practiced composure, said nothing in response, though something in her expression suggested the characterization didn't match her own understanding of what she actually did during those moments. What Langley never bothered to investigate, because Priya's file listed only standard civilian nursing credentials and her calm demeanor never invited the kind of curiosity that might have uncovered more, was that she had served 6 years as an Army medic attached to a specialized unit trained extensively in mass casualty response, and, more specifically, in recognizing and responding appropriately to active threat situations, where immediate physical movement, rather than careful auditory and situational assessment, often got people killed. Her stillness in moments of apparent chaos wasn't hesitation. It was a specific, trained pause designed to gather critical information before committing to action, a habit that had saved lives repeatedly during her military service in circumstances Langley couldn't begin to imagine. She kept a small collection of commendations in a box at home, documentation of exactly the instinct Langley considered her greatest professional weakness, though none of it had ever made its way into any conversation at Westgate. By her 9th month, Langley's scrutiny had become a defining feature of Priya's daily work environment, his critical eye following her through every shift, his comments during debriefs consistently framing her measured approach as a liability rather than an asset. The incident that would define everything began on a Wednesday afternoon during what started as a routine trauma case and rapidly escalated into something considerably more dangerous. Marcus Feldman, 38 years old, arrived at Westgate's ER following what paramedics initially reported as a single gunshot wound sustained during what witnesses described as a drive-by shooting outside a downtown convenience store. The trauma team moved into standard protocol, Priya among them, assessing and stabilizing the wound while the surgical team prepared for likely intervention. It was during this initial assessment, as Priya moved to check the wound's trajectory and severity, that she registered something that made her stop entirely, her body going still in a way that would later become the central point of contention in the entire incident. She had heard something, faint but unmistakable to someone trained specifically to listen for it, in the ambient noise filtering through the trauma bay's proximity to the ambulance entrance. A second gunshot, distant but distinct, fired somewhere outside the hospital. Her training, honed over years of exactly this kind of high-stakes auditory assessment, kicked in immediately, though not in the form of visible frantic movement. Instead, she went completely still, her head tilting slightly, every part of her attention focused on gathering additional auditory information before committing to any response. Langley, entering the trauma bay at that exact moment to check on the case's progress, saw only a nurse standing motionless during an active trauma situation, her stillness registering to him as exactly the kind of hesitation he'd been warning about for months. "Anand," he snapped, his voice cutting sharply through the room. "What are you doing? Move!" Priya, still processing the auditory information, held up a hand without turning to face him, a gesture that, in the charged atmosphere of the moment, read to Langley as outright insubordination rather than the urgent, focused concentration it actually represented. "I need everyone to be quiet for 1 second," she said, her voice low but carrying an unmistakable urgency that cut through the room's ambient noise. "This is not the time to be giving orders, Nurse Anand," Langley said, his fury escalating visibly. "This patient needs immediate attention and you're standing there frozen while—" "There's a second shooter," Priya said, cutting him off with a directness that silenced the room instantly. "I heard a second gunshot outside, distinct from the first incident. This isn't isolated. We need to lock down the ambulance bay immediately and alert security that there may be an active threat still developing outside this building." The room, which had been operating under the assumption that the crisis was fully contained to a single, already treated gunshot victim, absorbed this information with a specific, sudden shift in atmosphere. "You heard a gunshot," Langley said, skepticism plain in his voice despite the visible tension the statement had created. "Yes," Priya said, already moving now that she'd communicated the critical information, her earlier stillness transformed instantly into decisive, purposeful action. "I need someone to contact security immediately and initiate a partial lockdown of the ambulance bay. If there's an active shooter situation continuing outside, we need to prevent additional casualties from arriving into an unsecured entrance." Langley, still visibly skeptical, nonetheless found himself unable to definitively contradict her given the specific, urgent confidence with which she delivered the warning. "Contact security," he said, finally, though his tone made clear he considered the precaution likely unnecessary. "But Anand, this patient still needs—" "I've got him," Priya said, already moving back to Feldman's side, her attention split now between his continued treatment and the broader situation she'd just flagged, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the added complexity of the moment. Security, contacted immediately, moved to partially secure the ambulance bay entrance, a precaution that would prove within the following 15 minutes to be considerably more necessary than Langley's initial skepticism had suggested. The gunman responsible for the original shooting, having fled the initial scene, had circled back toward the hospital, apparently intent on finishing what he'd started with Feldman, whom witnesses would later reveal had been a specific target rather than a random victim of the drive-by shooting the initial reports had suggested. The second gunshot Priya had registered had been fired at a pursuing witness who had attempted to stop the shooter's initial escape, an incident that occurred close enough to the hospital's perimeter that the sound had carried, faint but distinct, through the ambulance bay's proximity to the outdoor scene. 15 minutes after Priya's warning, security personnel, now alert and positioned at the partially secured entrance specifically because of her flagged concern, intercepted the returning gunman as he attempted to enter the ambulance bay directly, weapon still in hand, clearly intent on completing his original assault on Feldman. The interception, conducted by security personnel who had been given crucial advance warning and preparation time directly as a result of Priya's early auditory identification, prevented what could easily have become a considerably more catastrophic situation, a second targeted attack occurring inside an active trauma bay already full of vulnerable patients and staff. The gunman was apprehended without further injury to anyone, the weapon secured before he could gain entry to the building's interior, an outcome that hospital security, in the subsequent debrief, credited entirely to the advance warning that had allowed them crucial preparation time they otherwise wouldn't have had. Langley, processing the full sequence of events in the immediate aftermath, found himself confronting a version of what had just happened that directly contradicted the narrative he'd been building about Priya for the past 9 months. The mandatory incident review, convened the following day given the severity of what had nearly occurred, brought together Langley, Priya, Renata Foss, hospital security leadership, and several administrators to formally examine the sequence of events. "I want to understand exactly what happened in that trauma bay," the hospital CEO said, opening the review with a directness that made clear the stakes involved. "Specifically, I want to understand the moment where Nurse Anand identified the second threat, because from what security has told me, that identification and the subsequent lockdown may have prevented a considerably more serious incident." Langley, present for the review, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to account for his own reaction during the critical moment. "I initially interpreted Nurse Anand's pause as hesitation," he admitted, the words costing him something visible. "I've been concerned about her response time during high-pressure situations for several months, and in that moment, her stillness read to me as confirmation of that concern, rather than what it actually was." "What was it actually?" the CEO asked, turning toward Priya directly. "I was listening for a second shot," Priya said. "I'd registered the first gunshot sound faintly through the ambient noise, and my training taught me that in a situation involving potential firearms, the immediate priority is gathering additional auditory information before committing to a physical response, because moving prematurely, before you've properly assessed the scope and direction of a potential threat, can put you and everyone around you at greater risk rather than less." "Where does that training come from?" the CEO asked. Priya was quiet for a moment, weighing exactly how much to disclose in a room that had spent 9 months building a fundamentally incorrect narrative about her capabilities. "I served 6 years as an Army medic, attached to a specialized unit that trained extensively in mass casualty and active threat response. Recognizing and appropriately responding to the sound pattern of gunfire, including distinguishing between isolated incidents and ongoing threats, was a core component of that training. What Dr. Langley interpreted as hesitation was actually a specific, deliberate pause designed to gather critical information before acting, a technique that has proven repeatedly in far more dangerous circumstances than yesterday's incident, to prevent exactly the kind of premature action that gets people killed." The room absorbed this revelation with a heavy, specific silence. "You've had this background the entire 9 months you've worked here," Renata said slowly, "and it's never come up, despite Dr. Langley's ongoing concerns about your response patterns during high-pressure situations." "I mentioned it briefly during my initial hiring interview. It wasn't emphasized because civilian nursing credentials were the primary focus of that process. And after Dr. Langley's early comments about my response time, I made a decision to not volunteer additional context, partly out of frustration that my clinical judgment wasn't being evaluated on its own merits, and partly because I'd learned through prior experience that disclosing military background sometimes creates a different kind of scrutiny that I wasn't necessarily eager to invite." Langley, listening to this account with visible discomfort, finally spoke directly. "I need to be honest about something," he said. "I built an entire assessment of your professional competence around a single behavioral pattern without ever once asking what that pattern might actually represent. I assumed stillness meant hesitation because that's the framework I've operated within for years. A framework that apparently doesn't account for the possibility that stillness might, in some circumstances, represent exactly the correct response." "It's a common assumption," Priya said, not unkindly, but with a directness that had been building throughout the review. "Most people equate visible, immediate action with competence, and stillness with its absence. In the environment I trained in, that assumption gets people killed. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in a crisis is move before you've actually understood what you're moving into." The CEO, absorbing the full weight of the situation, turned to the broader implications with visible concern. "Dr. Langley, I understand you'd previously suggested Nurse Anand's employment be reconsidered, based specifically on the pattern of behavior we now understand to be a trained, deliberate response, rather than a deficiency. I need to understand exactly how close we came to terminating someone whose judgment, as demonstrated yesterday, likely prevented a mass casualty event inside this hospital. Langley, visibly struggling with the direct question, offered the only honest answer available. I'd raised the possibility of termination in a meeting scheduled for next week, he admitted, based on what I genuinely believed at the time was a pattern of concerning hesitation during critical moments. Yesterday's incident has fundamentally changed my understanding of what I was actually observing. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. I want to understand something else, the CEO said, turning back to Priya. During the incident itself, Dr. Langley directly ordered you to move, to abandon what he perceived as hesitation. You continued your assessment despite that direct order. Can you walk me through that decision? I made a judgment call, Priya said. I believed, based on training I trust considerably more than momentary institutional pressure, that continuing to gather information for those additional seconds was more likely to produce a safe outcome than immediately complying with an order that, in that specific moment, I believed to be based on an incomplete understanding of the actual threat. I recognize that decision could have been read as insubordination. I made it anyway because I judged the stakes to warrant that risk. You were right, CEO said, simply. I was right this time, Priya said. I want to be careful about the lesson we take from that. I'm not suggesting staff should routinely override direct orders from supervising physicians. I'm suggesting that this hospital needs a better mechanism for distinguishing between genuine hesitation and deliberate, trained assessment, because conflating the two nearly resulted in the termination of a nurse whose judgment in this specific instance prevented a considerably worse outcome. The formal review concluded with a set of institutional changes implemented over the following weeks, beginning with a complete reversal of the termination Langley had initiated, followed by a broader review of how the hospital evaluated staff response patterns during crisis situations, specifically incorporating training on distinguishing between hesitation and deliberate tactical assessment. Langley, in the aftermath of the review, requested a private meeting with Priya, arriving with a directness that had been notably absent from their previous interactions. I owe you a considerably more serious apology than I think a single conversation can adequately convey, he said. I spent 9 months building a professional narrative about you based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what I was actually observing, and that misunderstanding very nearly cost you your career. At the exact moment, your actual expertise prevented a genuine catastrophe in this building. I appreciate the acknowledgement, Priya said, but I'd ask you to consider something beyond the apology itself. This hospital's crisis response training focuses almost entirely on speed and immediate action without adequate consideration for situations where careful assessment, even brief assessment, produces better outcomes than immediate movement. That's a structural gap, not just a personal misjudgment on your part. You're right, Langley said. I'd like your help addressing that gap, if you're willing to be involved. Over the following months, Priya worked directly with Westgate's administration to develop revised crisis response training, specifically incorporating instruction on recognizing the difference between problematic hesitation and deliberate, trained tactical assessment, using her own experience and expertise to help reshape how the hospital evaluated staff behavior during high-pressure situations. Langley, humbled considerably by the preceding weeks, became an unlikely advocate for the revised training, presenting it to hospital leadership with a directness about his own failures that surprised colleagues accustomed to his earlier certainty. I nearly ended someone's career because I mistook trained expertise for weakness, he told the assembled staff during a training session. I want every person in this room to understand that stillness, in the right circumstances, from the right person, can be the most important action taken in an entire crisis. Learn to ask what someone is actually doing before you assume you already know. Marcus Feldman, recovering steadily from his initial injury and fully informed of the second attempt on his life that had been prevented specifically because of Priya's early warning, requested to speak with her once he was lucid enough to understand the full sequence of events. "They told me you're the reason there wasn't a second shooting inside this hospital, that you heard something nobody else caught while everyone was focused entirely on treating me. I heard something my training taught me to listen for. The treating you part and the listening part weren't actually separate priorities. They were both part of the same assessment." "Why didn't anyone believe you right away?" Feldman asked. "Because most people expect a crisis response to look loud and immediate," Priya said. "Mine doesn't always look that way. I've had to learn to communicate what I'm doing more clearly, precisely because of moments like yesterday, where silence, however necessary, gets misread as failure if nobody understands what it actually represents." Security leadership, formally reviewing the incident's outcome, requested that Priya consult directly on the hospital's broader emergency preparedness protocols, incorporating her military training into a more comprehensive approach to threat identification and response. "Most hospital staff are trained to react to obvious, immediate danger," the head of security told her during their first consultation. "What you demonstrated was something considerably more valuable, the ability to identify a developing threat before it became obvious, using information most people wouldn't have even registered as significant." "That's specifically what my training emphasized. The moments before a crisis becomes undeniable are often the moments where the most effective intervention is still possible. Once something becomes obvious to everyone, you've often already lost your best window for prevention." Renata Foss, reflecting on her own role in allowing Langley's assessment of Priya to go unchallenged for 9 months, requested to work directly with Priya on revising the hospital's approach to staff performance evaluation, ensuring that behavioral patterns were assessed with genuine curiosity about their underlying cause rather than surface-level interpretation. "I watched Dr. Langley build a narrative about you for 9 months and never once pushed back seriously enough," Renata said. "That's a failure on my part as much as his, and I want to help make sure this department doesn't repeat that mistake with someone else." 2 months later, Westgate Medical Center looked much the same on the surface, but something underneath had shifted permanently. The revised crisis response training became standard practice across the hospital, specifically incorporating instruction on the difference between hesitation and deliberate tactical assessment, a distinction that nearly cost Priya her career before it saved an unknown number of lives inside that trauma bay. Langley changed the way he evaluated staff performance entirely, implementing a formal practice of asking direct questions about observed behavior patterns before drawing conclusions about their underlying cause. "Ask before you assume," he told incoming residents now, a lesson learned directly from his own uncomfortable reckoning. What looks like hesitation to you might be the exact expertise that saves everyone in the room if you're willing to actually understand what you're observing before you judge it. Priya continued working at Westgate exactly as she always had, quiet and precise. Her characteristic stillness during moments of apparent crisis no longer read as weakness by anyone who had witnessed or heard about exactly what that stillness had prevented. She still paused when the situation called for it, gathering critical information before committing to visible action. She still trusted that training, developed under circumstances far more dangerous than anything Westgate's civilian environment typically produced, over the institutional pressure to move immediately, regardless of whether immediate movement actually served the situation. But nobody at Westgate mistook her pauses for failure anymore. Because everyone in that hospital finally understood what a single critical moment of stillness had proven beyond any argument about speed or urgency. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a crisis is moving before you understand what you're moving into. Stillness and hesitation are not the same thing, though institutions built around visible urgency often fail to recognize the difference until the cost of that failure becomes undeniable. The most valuable response to a developing threat sometimes looks, to an untrained eye, exactly like doing nothing at all. And sometimes the person nearly fired for freezing was never frozen in the first place, simply listening with trained and deliberate precision for the second shot everyone else in the room hadn't yet learned to hear. The end. This story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes only.